Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of True Drew Podcast. I hope you guys are having a good summer so far. I've been enjoying the weather and some extra downtime lately. I've gotten to hang out with family and do fun summery stuff, like go to the pool, do things like that. So I hope you guys have had time to do fun stuff too. I also hope you guys have gotten to read a lot of books this summer. I love to read books by the pool or on road trips. Like, I'll read a book anywhere though. I'm one of those people that I always have a book in my purse or in my car because you never know when you're going to get unexpected downtime and you're just I don't know what to do. Oh, wait a minute. I'm going to read this Nancy Drew book. And speaking of Nancy Drew books, we're going to be covering a book today. This is book number 69, The Clue in the Ancient Disguise. And this book first came out in 1982. So I was able to find 3 separate book covers to talk about with you guys today. And if you ever want to see these book covers, I post these on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, on Wednesdays before these episodes come out on Thursdays. Another thing that's really cool, I actually own all of these book covers. I'm a nerd. I like to collect the different book covers and different variations because I just think it's fun. I know a lot of people would be like, wait, it's the same book, but it's just cool. I don't know. I can't explain it. I just love to see how Nancy has evolved over the years. But this first book cover shows Nancy in this really crowded and junky looking attic. There's a trunk behind her that's open and there's stuff spilling out of it. And Nancy herself is wearing this purple cap-sleeved shirt. It looks like it has lace on the sleeves and a little flared out skirt, which is super cute. She's got the strawberry blonde hair. And if I didn't know any better, what she's holding almost looks like a mink coat. But if you read the book, it's actually, as described in the book, it's a peasant type dress. And Nancy and her friend Lisa find it in the attic. So this is a scene directly from the book. And the artist for this book cover is Ruth Sanderson. So this second book cover, Nancy looks very late 80s, early 90s on this cover. She's got khaki pants and a pink sweater vest over a white t-shirt. And she's got more blonde hair here and it's kind of feathered and kind of off her forehead. And there's a knight. And this knight in armor is just taking up the majority of this book cover with an axe. It looks really scary. And there is a tagline on this book cover. It says, "An old mystery springs to life in a museum vault." And the artist for this book cover is Garen Baker. Now, the third and final book cover we have shows Nancy in the basement of the museum. A lot of this mystery takes place in this museum in River Heights. There's all these paintings around her. She's holding, it looks like a walkie-talkie. I think it may be the security guy's two-way radio or something. But Nancy is wearing blue jeans, sneakers, and an oversized pink sweatshirt. I would rock this look all day long. Props, Nancy. I'm so glad, in the later paperbacks, she wears more practical clothing sometimes. Love it. But in the foreground, we see the arm of the knight in armor holding this huge axe, and it looks really, really sharp. There's a glint off of it. And that's all we see of him, but it's scary enough just seeing his arm and that huge axe. I don't know about you, but I would not want to be cornered in a basement by a medieval knight. I wouldn't want to be cornered anywhere by a medieval knight. And also, this whole time, it has been so hard for me to not say knight in shining armor. That has become such a popular saying that I'm what do you call it? Just armor? I mean, it's armor when nobody's inside of it and it's just an inanimate object, but it's a knight when somebody dons the armor, I guess, but it seems so weird to just say knight in armor. I keep wanting to say shining in the middle of that. I don't know. That's a me thing. But there is also a tagline on this third book cover, and it says, "An antique mystery springs to life in a museum vault." So not that much different from the tagline on the second book cover. And the artist for this third book cover is someone named Linda Thomas. So when it comes to a funny cover spoof, I came up with Nancy Drew, and she's just enjoying the local nightlife. I mean, come on, how was I supposed to pass up that pun opportunity? Nancy Drew. She's working the night shift. Mystery never sleeps. So when it comes to rating these book covers, I would give these 4 magnifying glasses. I actually like all 3 book covers very well. I love that the first book cover shows Nancy in the attic, and that's a key scene in the book. But I do like the other 2 covers because we actually get the knight in armor on the cover, and I think that's really cool and a big part of the mystery. So now let's go ahead and discuss the characters that we see in The Clue in the Ancient Disguise. So first up we have Pierre Michaud. Michaud? I believe that's how you say it. It's French, so I apologize if I'm butchering that. There's also Louise Duval, Lisa Thorpe, who is Louise's grandniece, Norton Thorpe, who is Lisa's father. We have like a multi-generational mystery going on here. There's also Mr. Gregory, who's the art museum curator, Jane Heron, who's the assistant curator, Lee Talbot, who's an artist, Peter Warden, who's a reporter, Henry Grisson, Leon Furbury, and I just put friend of Louise's, Emily Ausler, who is a maid we encounter, Miss Grail, who is Professor Crawford's daughter. Professor Crawford sadly has passed away, so he didn't get a mention on the character list here. There's Mr. Varney, who is a man financing Pierre Michaud's company, Naira Betts, who is Pierre's assistant, Yvette Duval, who is an ancestor of Lisa Thorpe's and some other people, Jonas Becker, Louise Duval's lawyer, Maxwell Fleen, a lawyer that inherited Becker's practice, and that's everybody. Sorry, that's a lot of people. I know that's super confusing, but don't worry, it'll make way more sense as we start diving into this mystery. So now I'll go ahead and read a brief synopsis for The Clue in the Ancient Disguise. Pierre Michaud, a young Frenchman, has found a letter in his grandfather's papers that hints at an ancient family secret. Somehow, the secret is tied to the burglaries at the River Heights Art Museum and an heirloom gown. Sewn in the hem of the dress is an antique locket with a portrait of a boy who looks almost exactly like Pierre Michaud. The letter, the locket, and the break-ins add up to the kind of mystery Nancy Drew just can't resist, even though someone is determined to stop her. A royal inheritance hangs in the balance, and Nancy alone has the power to return a noble title to its rightful owner. Now for a dramatically read newspaper headline synopsis. Sacre bleu! Local tech entrepreneur discovers he is a count, thanks to Nancy Drew. Okay, so now let's go ahead and jump into the direct quotes and notes that I took down while reading The Clue in the Ancient Disguise. So our mystery starts with Nancy and Carson talking to this man named Pierre Michaud, who found a letter in his grandfather's belongings from a woman named Louise Duval, and the letter says she found something interesting when tracing her ancestry that concerns her and Pierre's father. So Nancy asks Carson if there was any luck locating Louise, but Carson says she died several years ago, not long after the letter was written, in fact. But Carson did find a relative of hers, a woman named Lisa Thorpe, who is her grandniece and happens to be just a few years older than Nancy. Nancy also asks if Pierre has spoken to Lisa, and he flushes. He gets really embarrassed when Nancy asks him this, and he says that her father, Norton, was not very nice to him, and Nancy wonders if there's more to the story. So Nancy decides that she's going to take Pierre to lunch to talk more about the case, and according to him, he's come to America from France to obtain financial backing for a computer memory project he's been working on. And there's a man named Mr. Varney who has helped him out and gotten him a workplace here in River Heights. And Pierre also confides in Nancy. He says he likes Lisa, but her father hates him. So Nancy was right. She sensed there was more to the story, and there was. So it seems like Norton is not Pierre's biggest fan. So while Nancy and Pierre are talking about this at the restaurant, Nancy notices this man staring at them from across the street, which is really, really creepy. And about that time, a waiter brings a phone to Nancy and Pierre's table and says it's urgent. So Nancy picks up the phone, and it's Carson's secretary on the line, Miss Hanson, and she says she got a call from Pierre's assistant, Naira Betts, who's saying that his workshop is on fire. So Nancy and Pierre leave in a hurry, and when they get to the workshop, Pierre pulls Naira out of the building, and then she just throws herself all over him. It's super dramatic. And it's funny because the book says it's obvious to Nancy that Naira has a crush on Pierre because she just keeps shooting Nancy these angry looks. And Nancy notices something else strange. They beat the fire department to the workshop that was on fire. So it's like Nancy says the River Heights Fire Department is known for their speedy response time. So she's like, it's almost like Naira called the fire department after she called Carson's office. Like she wanted Pierre to get there to save her first. So Nancy's also wondering, like, did she set the fire too intentionally? So after Naira pries herself away from Pierre for a second, the fire department shows Pierre a painted threat on a wall that says, "Go home, Frenchie, or a lot worse will happen." And he's really upset by this. I mean, I think that's a pretty reasonable response. I mean, he was just threatened, and his workshop where he makes his livelihood was set on fire, so not something you take lightly. So after Nancy leaves the scene of the fire, she realizes why the name Lisa Thorpe sounds so familiar to her. That was who Carson mentioned earlier. And Lisa just so happens to work at a thrift store with Bess. So Nancy goes to the thrift store and she convinces Bess and Lisa to go get ice cream so she can ask Lisa about Pierre. So according to Nancy, Lisa seems to like Pierre as much as he likes her, but Lisa is upset about Naira working for him because Lisa and Naira used to be friends. So it seems like there's some animosity and tension there. They both like the same guy, so that's a bit awkward. But Nancy also gets another valuable tidbit of information. She learns from Lisa that Louise Duvall had a maid, Emily Ausler, and Lisa may still have her address. Nancy's really excited about this, but Lisa also tells Nancy and Bess that they can come over to her house to see the portrait of one of her ancestors, Yvette, who apparently came to River Heights 200 years ago. So after they're done eating ice cream, Nancy takes Lisa back to the thrift store to get her car, and she sees the same man that was watching her and Pierre at the restaurant earlier, but he leaves. Who is this guy and why is he following Nancy? So next, Nancy and Bess go see the portrait of Yvette at Lisa's house, and they meet her dad, Norton Thorpe, but he gets mad when he hears they're helping Pierre. He just does not like Pierre or anyone that associates with him, so he tells them to leave. But it's funny because Nancy basically says back to him, "We came here as your daughter's guests and thought this was her home too, but we'll leave." Like, she just tells him off. So I thought that was kind of funny, and Norton, like, you can literally see steam pouring out of his ears is what the book basically says. But Lisa runs out after them and she apologizes on behalf of her father. So when Nancy gets back home for the night, Hannah tells her she got a call from a Mr. Gregory, who's a local art museum curator. And this is the part when we now have two mysteries that we're trying to solve, because it's never a Nancy Drew mystery unless she's solving 2 or 3 mysteries at the same time. Like, she's the best at multitasking. But he apparently wants her help because there have been 2 break-ins lately at the museum. So Nancy tells Hannah that she'll call him later, and first she gives a call to Louise Duvall's former maid, Emily Ausler, so she can schedule a visit with her. The next thing that I wrote down here in my notes, I said the book gives us a clue that it's autumn because it says it was a chill autumn night with a gathering mist. So I don't know. I always like to write down when it gives us a clue as to what time of year it is in these books. So next, Nancy talks to Emily, the maid, who is now in her 70s, and she says she remembers Miss Duvall hiring someone to do foreign research, quote unquote, and she also gives Nancy the name of Miss Duvall's lawyer, who was Jonas Becker. And she also says that Miss Duvall never did make it to France because she died unexpectedly. And Emily says she came back from a walk very upset one night and said a red car had almost run her over, and it was not long after that that she had a heart attack. So Nancy thanks Miss Duvall's former maid, and she leaves with all this information that she's gathered, and when she goes to drive home, she notices a red car following her that looks as if it doesn't have a driver. This gave me chills, like, ugh, like what if you heard a story like that where someone was like, oh, you know, someone passed in a sudden and tragic way, and then they saw this car not long before they passed, and then you go to get in your car and you see the car of the same description following you, like, And the fact that it looks like nobody's driving it, that is so strange. So Nancy finally is able to get away from this red car, and she pulls into her driveway and she gets out, only to see the man who was watching her and Pierre at the restaurant earlier come out of the shadows around her house. Nope. This is why whenever I get out of my car and it's pitch black outside and really dark, I do that awkward, like, run to the door thing. Like, does anyone else do that? Because, like, I don't know what's in the dark, in the shadows. Like, anything could be out there. Anyone could get you. I'm not trying to make you paranoid, but it's just like the fact that Nancy Drew she has so many villains show up right outside her front door. They break into her house. Like, I think I would move or get a better security system. Like the pots and pans that Hannah tied to that clothesline inside the house in whatever book that was we talked about on another episode, like, that's not cutting it anymore. We need Brink's security, y'all. So the man comes at Nancy and he's super aggressive and he tells Nancy to stop helping Pierre. And he also asks where Nancy went and who she saw, and she tells him it's none of his business, which I applauded her for this. I was like, that's pretty brave of you, Nancy, when this guy's standing right in front of you in your front yard. Now, thankfully, about this time, Togo starts barking and he alerts Hannah, so Hannah turns on the porch light and comes outside and the guy runs off. And this made me so happy to see Togo because we haven't seen him in a few books. I was wondering what had happened to him. So Hannah comforts Nancy after this incident, and we also learn from this little scene where she's kind of just being very motherly to Nancy that she volunteers at the River Heights Hospital once a week. Honestly, I would expect nothing less of Hannah. She's an absolute treasure. So Nancy talks to Carson when he gets home for the night, and she tells him what happened, and Nancy asks about the law firm of Jonas Becker, who was working for Louise Duvall. And Carson says he and his partner have unfortunately passed away, and it's now owned by someone named Maxwell Fleen, who Carson doesn't approve of. Now, if Carson Drew doesn't give you a glowing review, as far as I'm concerned, your name is probably mud. And also, with a name like Maxwell Fleen, it sounds like spleen, it sounds weird, I don't know why they give these villains the worst names. It's not bad enough that they are just horrible people. They're just like, we're gonna give them the weirdest sounding names just so the reader knows they're awful. But yeah, I would trust anything that Carson has to say. Like, if Carson Drew left a Yelp review or something on a local restaurant, I'd be like, he knows what's up. Like, I trust this man. He's a distinguished attorney, you know? So next, Nancy goes to talk to Maxwell Fleen about Miss Duvall, but he's uncooperative. He's basically like, well, this is a breach of, client and attorney confidentiality. I can't tell you anything. Never mind that all parties are dead, like Louise Duvall is dead, her lawyers are dead. Like, Maxwell Fleen just inherited all of the assets for this law office, but still, he's not going to talk. So as Nancy is leaving his office, she sees Bess and George standing by her car, and Nancy walks up to them and she's like, oh, fancy seeing you here. And they say, hey, some woman was poking around in your car through the open window, but we scared her off. This was kind of alarming, but hey, I was just proud of Nancy for locking her car door because she never does that, and things happen, like her car gets stolen, bombs get put in there, so at least she had the sense to lock the door. She didn't roll the window up, but it's a start. So Nancy looks around in her car, but nothing appears to be taken, so she kind of just shrugs it off. So Nancy asks Bess and George if they want to go to the art museum with her, and they say yes, and as they're entering the museum, this alarm goes off, but it's a false alarm. They were just testing the system. The museum has decided to put in a new security system because of all the break-in problems they've been having. So Nancy breaks off from Bess and George and they go look at some art while she goes to talk to Mr. Gregory, and he says that intruders hid in a bathroom at closing time, and that's how they gained access that way the first time, after hours. And the night guard was tied up one time, and another time almost hurt by falling crates in the basement. So the intruders were in the basement both times. So Nancy's like, something valuable must be down there. So while Nancy's there at the museum, she notices an old picture on the wall that is of the Duvall family in the 1890s, and she finds out that they helped found the art museum. And Mr. Gregory also tells her about an old painting the Duvalls had placed in the museum. It wasn't particularly valuable, but Louise Duvall got really upset when she learned that it had been moved from the place where she wanted it hung, and she died not long after that. So Nancy leaves the museum after agreeing to investigate the break-ins, and she sees Bess and George talking to a man who won a local art contest, and his name is Lee Talbot. So while I was reading this book, this name sounded so familiar. I was like, Lee Talbot, where have I heard that? Well, it's very similar to a name of a character in the game White Wolf of Icicle Creek. Lou Talbot. Lee Talbot, Lou Talbot, so I thought that was kind of cool. And according to the book, he won the contest with a painting called Feline Still Life. And so Nancy comes up and she overhears him gloating, and there's this reporter who shows up and kind of edges his way into the conversation with Nancy, Bess, George, and Lee. And he's a reporter for the River Heights Record named Peter Warden, and he mocks Lee and says he's at the museum looking for fresh material, implying that he copies other people's work. Yikes. Well, naturally, Lee doesn't take very kindly to that, and he gets in Peter's face. And Peter holds his ground, though, and Lee eventually leaves, saying to the girls that he can't stand the air pollution around here any longer. I thought that was kind of funny. I was like, I'm gonna use that. Whenever you're in the middle of an unpleasant conversation with someone, just be like, okay, I can't stand this air pollution any longer, so I'm gonna go. So Nancy and the girls ask why Lee Talbot got so mad, and Peter says he thinks his painting looks too similar to another one that he's seen in the museum years ago, and it was of an Egyptian bust, a gray cat, and a moon. So very specific imagery. So if that imagery showed up in Lee's work also, that's quite a coincidence. So Nancy, Bess, and George leave the museum to go get milkshakes, and after talking for a while, Nancy calls the maid Emily Ausler again from a telephone booth, and she mentions her former employer loved to play bridge, and one of the women she played with, who is named Miss Leon Furbury, maybe can help Nancy with her case, so Emily passes along her information. So next in our story, Nancy goes to see Pierre at his office, and Naira Betts, his assistant, scowls at her and acts like she knows something. Naira is not what we would call a girl's girl. Like, she just wants Pierre for herself. She's jealous of Nancy, even though Nancy has no romantic interest in this man whatsoever. But anyway, Pierre invites Nancy to lunch, and they get in her car to go, but then he gets huffy and gets out and walks back into the workshop with no explanation. So Nancy's confused. She gets out of her car and goes back in to talk to him, and she's like, what's wrong? And he walks back out to her car and points to a sticker on her dashboard that says Data Link. And according to Pierre, it's a rival computer company that has been harassing him. So Nancy puts two and two together, and she realizes that the woman poking around in her car must have stuck that sticker on her dashboard, and the description that Bess and George gave her of the woman that was messing with her car matches Naira Betts. But is there something nefarious going on, or is this just jealousy on Naira's part? Like, is she just trying to keep Pierre away from anyone but herself? So after this, Nancy insists like I had nothing to do with this, and she explains what happened. Pierre trusts her again, and they go to lunch. And Naira looks furious, which I was like, serves you right, ma'am. But Pierre says he wants Nancy to meet his investor, Mr. Varney, the next day. Now, after this, Nancy calls Miss Leon Furbury, Louise Duvall's friend from her bridge club, and she mentions the man she thinks was researching things for her, the foreign research quote-unquote, was a man named Professor Crawford. And she also says that Louise wanted to prove the painting her family placed in the museum was valuable to prove the museum people were wrong. You know, this could just be one of those things like art is in the eye of the beholder, because I'm sure people battle this on a daily basis. Like, if you have a museum and someone helps found it and they have horrible taste in art, like, maybe there's no such thing as horrible taste in art, but I've seen paintings that I'm like, that one just doesn't speak to me. Like to each their own. But she wanted to prove that this painting was more valuable than the museum put stock in it. So Nancy goes back to the museum to talk to the curator, Mr. Gregory, and he says he thinks the intruders are after that same painting that Louise Duvall had a thing for. So Nancy asks how he knows this, and he says he knows because it's gone. And he also says that one of his assistants, Jane Heron, got a phone call asking about the painting specifically before the first break-in. Well, you know, you may be onto something there. So Jane Heron herself comes in to announce some good and bad news. And the good news is the painting may not be missing after all, but the bad news is the basement storage area is so unorganized after the break-in that it may be a while before they know for sure if it's in the building or somewhere else. So when Jane leaves, Nancy quietly asks Mr. Gregory if it could be an inside job, and he says that had occurred to him, and that's when Nancy Nancy proposes an idea. She asks Mr. Gregory if he will make it known that the alarm system is still down, like just talk about it casually while he's in the museum to employees and visitors alike, and she and some of her friends will hide in the museum and try to catch the burglars, and he agrees. So as Nancy leaves, she sees the same swarthy thug is what the book describes him as that has been watching her and Pierre throughout the entire book. So next, Nancy recruits Bess and George for her literal night at the museum, her stakeout, and after they agree, she goes to see Professor Crawford, but it turns out he's dead too. And I just wrote down, there's a lot of literal dead ends in this mystery. Like, this person passed away, this person passed away. So Nancy, luckily, is able to turn up more leads and more clues, but every time someone ended up having passed on, I was like, dang it. So instead, she talks to this man named Professor Schmidt, who replaced Professor Crawford, and according to him, Professor Crawford specialized in the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. And I just put, I wonder if he runs in the same circles as Professor Hotchkiss. But Professor Schmidt also says that Professor Crawford had a daughter and gives Nancy her address. So Nancy, Bess, and George, armed with coffee, go to the museum for their night watch, and the guard, Mr. Baxter, lets them in, and they go down to the basement with a walkie-talkie, and they wait. So minutes or hours later, they hear clanking metal footsteps, and a knight in full armor walks in with an axe. And he knocks the walkie-talkie out of Nancy's hand with the axe after she calls the guard, and there's no reply. I think the book says that he used the blunt end, like the handle of the axe, to do that, because, I mean, he could have chopped Nancy's hand off. But I'm sorry, like, if this happened to me, I would not be in the still life section. I would be in the afterlife section. I would be deceased, fully deceased. I would be like, nope. Like, it'd be so creepy to stay in a museum at night and then just see a full suit of armor walking towards you. Like, it's also kind of Scooby-Doo-ish, but it would still be terrifying. So the girls run into this side room off of the basement and shut the door. And this also, you know, thinking about it now, the night kind of reminds me of the game Mystery of the Seven Keys, which that night, in the passageways was so scary. But Nancy bravely goes out of the side room and she whacks the knight with the flat end of the axe. She's able to get it when he sits it down, and he runs away, but he locks them in the basement storage area. So Nancy uses a paperclip to pick the lock, and they go call the police. And after this, they're walking around the museum trying to find why the night guard didn't respond to their call on the walkie-talkie, and they find Mr. Baxter, who was chloroformed, and he's laying on the floor. So when the police get there, they say they'll dust the armor for fingerprints and get back to them. Now, the next day, Nancy tells Carson and Hannah what happened at the museum, and at Hannah's advice, Nancy goes to see Mr. Teakin at the River Heights Historical Society to dig up more on the Duval family. And he says he'll look through the archives and get back with her. So next, Nancy goes back to the museum to talk to Mr. Gregory, and she's told by an employee that he's in the basement, but she finds Jane Heron there instead, the assistant. And Nancy notices her moving and reorganizing things in the basement, and one of the paintings catches Nancy's eye because it's of an Egyptian bust, a cat, and a moon. So Nancy takes a picture of it with her purse camera. I just love the fact that Nancy has a purse camera. Like, I remember those days. You used to carry around like a little digital camera, or I did in the early 2000s, like before cell phones could take really good pictures. I'm dating myself here. Now, when Nancy finally talks to Mr. Gregory, they theorize about the break-in, and Nancy asks if the curator has a private telephone, and he says yes, it's in his office. And the guard heard it ringing the night that the knight in shining armor showed up, and Nancy thinks it was teamwork, that one thief hid in Mr. Gregory's office, and the other watched the guard. And when the guard went to the upper floor, the thief downstairs called the office phone, and then they subdued the guard. Mr. Gregory likes Nancy's theory, and he thinks that that's probably what did happen. Now next, Nancy goes to see Peter Warden, the reporter, and she asks him to describe Lee Talbot's award-winning painting. And when he shows her the painting that Lee Talbot entered into the art contest and won with, it's identical to the one she saw in the basement, and she tells him this off the record. So next, after Nancy leaves his office, she drops off her film from her purse camera to be developed, and she goes to see see Professor Crawford's daughter, Miss Grayle, and she was too young to remember her father's work at all, and she donated his papers to the university, so that's kind of a dead lead. Now next, Nancy goes to see Pierre and his backer, Mr. Varney, and she finds Pierre with a businessman named Marston Parker who is interested in Pierre's computers. Now while Nancy's there, she hears Pierre comment that Naira moves his tools around a lot, and this girl just really doesn't want him to succeed. Like, I get this feeling that she just wants him to stay in River Heights so she can just have her claws in him. But Pierre starts to demonstrate the computer for this guy who's interested in it, and Nancy notices scratch marks and crooked screws and warns Pierre, but it's too late. And when he switches on the computer, it explodes. Someone purposefully tampered with it. Luckily, no one is hurt, but Mr. Parker is disappointed, and Pierre says he's lost a month's worth of work. So Nancy calls Lisa Thorpe after this, and she asks if they can look through Louise Duval's things that she said were in their attic at their house, and she says yes, tomorrow. So Nancy hands the phone to Pierre so they can talk to, because Nancy just gets the feeling, she's like, Norton, Lisa's dad, doesn't approve of Pierre, and so she's almost positive, like, he's probably listening in on the phone, or he doesn't let Lisa call him or be around him, so she's definitely playing a little bit of matchmaker here. They have a bit of a forbidden romance going on, thanks to Lisa's disapproving dad. So after this, Nancy goes home, and she gets a call from Mr. Teakin at the Historical Society, and he says he found an article about how Paul and Yvette Duval came to River Heights in 1796 from England, not France, which they were believed to have been French, so that's a bit odd. Now, after Nancy gets off the phone with him, Nancy takes a lot of phone calls in this book, she gets a call from Lisa, who asks her to come over tonight instead of tomorrow, and when Nancy gets there, Lee Talbot is there, and he apparently seems to like Lisa, who does not reciprocate. He puts an arm around her, and she, shrugs away from him, and he's also really arrogant and brags about his paintings. So Nancy asks where he got the inspiration for his winning painting from the contest, and he gets furious at her and defensive, and he leaves. I mean, if you had nothing to hide, why would you act like that? And, Nancy doesn't really care, though, because she's like, mission accomplished. We got rid of this guy who was all over Lisa. So Nancy and Lisa laugh about how pompous Lee is, and Lisa confesses to Nancy that her dad wants her to marry Lee Talbot because he's rich. And I just put, ugh. Norton Thorpe is the real villain in this story, as far as I'm concerned. But Lisa tells Nancy also that she lost her mother at a young age, and she and Nancy kind of bond over that since Nancy lost her mother at a young age. Lisa also tells her that her mother was the daughter of Louise Duval's twin brother, Louis. And I said, I'm sorry, those names are too similar. Why do people do that? Louis, Louise, that would be so confusing. But anyways, Louise Duval's mansion was torn down and sold for an industrial development. And Lisa says the family heirlooms are in the attic and Nancy can look at them. So about that time, they start to hear footsteps overhead, but there's nobody else at home. Lisa's dad is still at work, so that's really freaky. And the only other person there, I think, is Booker, their valet, who's in the kitchen. He wouldn't be upstairs anyway. So they call the police, but Nancy gets impatient waiting for them to show up, and she goes to the attic to check it out. And Booker comes as a bodyguard with a rolling pin and a flashlight, followed by Lisa, which I thought was hilarious, but a rolling pin would make a really good weapon. So they find that a window is open in the attic, but it hasn't been opened by the storm, and it seems deliberate, like somebody was tampering with it and they pushed their way in. So the police finally show up, but they aren't so sure that it was an intruder, and they say they'll report it anyways. Thanks, River Heights PD. So Nancy actually sees that dust has been wiped clean in places throughout the attic, which is odd because Lisa says nobody ever goes up there, so it does suggest that someone was there. Now, about this time, Mr. Thorpe comes home and he's aggravated to see Nancy in his house, so he gloats over the fact that he heard on the radio about Pierre's invention blowing up in his face, which, again, wow, news travels fast in River Heights, but he says Pierre is a scoundrel of a Frenchman. Norton Thorpe is just a jerk, but I was proud of Lisa in this moment because she defends Pierre, and Mr. Thorpe actually backs down and walks off. He just goes, harumph, and then he just leaves. So Nancy and Lisa go back up to the attic and they look through a trunk that's up there, and they find all kinds of dresses from the early 1800s. And I was just thinking about, those would be so fragile, but it would be so cool to see clothing that old. And they also notice mixed in with the clothing is this peasant type of dress, because there's a lot of nicer ball gowns and this one just seems kind of out of place. And they find a wedding ring that falls out that says Yvette and Philippe, 1789, but Yvette was married to a guy named Paul, so this is a little bit strange. Somebody call an arborist because we got some scandal in the family tree. Now, when Nancy leaves the Thorpe house, it starts pouring and she's followed by a red car again, the one that looks like it has no driver, and then her power steering goes out in her car and she goes off the road. Now, thankfully Nancy's okay, but has to call to have the car towed, and she has to walk home in the rain. Nancy has some of the worst luck in the world. Now, the next morning, Nancy turns on the TV and she hears a story about Lee Talbot's art plagiarism and her own name as having been the one to discover it. So she's really upset about this because she told the reporter, Peter Warden, this off the record. So she calls him and he insists he didn't tell, and Nancy believes him. But he also says he tries to grant the requests of beautiful girls. Subtle. It also wouldn't be a Nancy Drew book without random men flirting with her. Also, at this point in the book, when I was reading it, I was like, where is Ned? Ned Nickerson has been completely absent for this entire book. So the next thing that happens is Nancy gets a call from Emily Owsler, Louise's old maid, who has a photo album that she wants Nancy to have, and she says it might help with her case. And then directly after this, Nancy gets another phone call, she's really racking up the minutes, from Lee Talbot, who says he's suing her. And Nancy says, that's fine, my dad will be my counsel. Comes in handy to have a lawyer as a dad. So Nancy later goes to the art museum and Mr. Gregory says they've found the Duval painting. And this painting shows a man in a powdered wig wearing 18th century clothing, and Nancy remarks that he looks familiar to her. So Mr. Gregory says he'll call an art historian expert to try and identify who the man in the picture is. But he has to leave to talk to the trustees, so Nancy leaves his office, and when she's going out the door, she spots Jane Heron cleaning a painting. So Nancy talks about getting in trouble with Lee Talbot to her, and Jane admits that she thinks she's to blame because a news crew came by and talked to her, and Jane mentioned that she saw Nancy take a picture of the copied painting in the basement, the one that had the Egyptian bust, the cat, and the moon, and they just ran with it. So Nancy accepts her apology. She knows there was nothing malicious in it. There was no intent to harm her, so she's like, it's okay. Now, after Nancy leaves the museum, she goes to Pierre's workshop, and he says someone is coming from the National Computer Company to see his work. And as they're talking, Mr. Varney, his financial backer, comes by and says he may pull his funding because of the negative press. Pierre is really upset about this because he needs that funding as he's a startup company, but Nancy starts watching him while they're having this interaction. Pierre is talking to Mr. Varney, and she thinks Pierre looks a lot like the Duval portrait she saw earlier, and she asks him, after Mr. Varney leaves, if his family could have been aristocratic, and he says no, they have humble origins. So after talking to Pierre, Nancy goes to talk to her dad, and he gets a phone call saying Nancy is being sued for libel by Lee Talbot. Carson isn't worried though, and he just takes Nancy to lunch. He's like, we'll handle this. So they go, and he says some guy named Henry Grisson, an attorney, came and asked about Pierre, but no one by that name exists because he's already checked into them. He's like, there's no French attorney by that name. So after Nancy and Carson eat lunch, Nancy calls Chief McGinnis and asks if he can look into Louise Duval's death to see if there was any foul play, because there's just been a lot of suspicious things. The painting was moved, and there was this red car suspiciously following her, and then she turns up dead. So it's kind of fishy. And after talking to Chief McGinnis, Nancy is followed by the swarthy man in a green car, and she loses loses him, the same guy who's been following her through the majority of this book. So she gives Chief McGinnis the license plate number to look into. Now, after this, Nancy goes to get the photo album from Emily Ausler, the maid of Louise Duval, and when she drops it while getting it out of the closet, a letter in French to Yvette falls out, and it was written in 1797 by someone named Charlotte that says she's still trying to find Yvette's treasure, but hopes she enjoys her new home in the United States. Now, I know the term United States has been around since the founding of our country, but it really took me out of the story a little bit. Like, I don't know, it seems like in old movies or old books and literature, you hear it referred to more as the Americas or the colonies or, the New World. But, United States is acceptable. It took me out of it a little bit. It reminds me of that weird phenomenon. Like, I think I talked about this in the Secret of the Wooden Lady episode where I was like, Melissa just doesn't sound like a name that would have been around in the 17 or 1800s. I don't know why, but I feel like I do that sometimes. I'll be like, that doesn't sound old enough. But anyways, based on this letter, Nancy is beginning to think that Yvette was married twice. First to someone named Philippe, and then to someone named Paul after Philippe died. But what is the treasure they're referring to? So Nancy and Emily look through the photo album, and the maid recognizes a man in a picture as being the one who did research for her employer, Louise Duval, but she doesn't remember his name. But that's okay because we already know that his name is Professor Crawford. But he's standing in front of an old mill, so Nancy takes the photo with her. She's like, maybe we can find this place and maybe there will be a clue there. So Nancy goes to pick up her film that's been developed from her purse camera. Wow, those were the days. And she goes to Carson's office to meet with Lee Talbot and his attorney. And the attorney starts saying Nancy should pay for defamation to the artist's character, and Nancy just lays the developed picture on the table and she says, look at this, like an absolute boss. And she says, I haven't said anything to the police, but when they see the evidence, they might get the idea that you had a motive for these museum break-ins. In other words, you were trying to remove or destroy the original painting that would prove your plagiarism. Mic drop. So Lee and his attorney are speechless at this, and Nancy has a feeling Lee didn't consciously copy it. She thinks maybe he saw it as a kid and it made an impression on him, and she's very gracious. I think, call it what it is. It's plagiarism. But they leave and they say they'll consult about, the charges. So Carson just turns to Nancy and he's super impressed with her. Now, right after this happens, Chief McGinnis calls and says that he has a name to go with the license plate that Nancy gave him. And the car was rented to a French tourist named Andre Frenot. So that's the name of Nancy's swarthy stalker. Now, after this, Nancy gets another phone call, like I said, so many phone calls, from the museum curator, Mr. Gregory, and he says the portrait is most likely of French nobleman Comte d'Auvergne, I think is how you say that. I'm so bad at pronouncing French, but basically a count. So Nancy files this away and she talks to Professor Schmidt, who says he'll look things up on the count, and Nancy and George next go to see Professor Crawford's daughter, Miss Grayle, again. And Nancy shows her the picture of her father in front of the mill, and she recognizes it and says it's in Peachtown. And she says her father's old desk is still there and she owns the place, so they can go look around, and she says there may even be some documents still in the desk. So Nancy and George go back to the Drews' house and eat dinner with Bess, and they discuss the case, and Bess makes the comment, wouldn't it be cool if Yvette back in the 1790s had been a spy? So Nancy talks to Professor Schmidt again, who says he found out that the Count was beheaded by the guillotine around the time of the French Revolution. So Nancy, Bess, and George go to see Lisa again, who has suddenly grown a backbone and says her father is home, but they could still come by, which this was such a defiant move on her part, because at first she was very meek in the beginning of this story. So I was like, snaps for Lisa, she has grown a spine. So while the girls are looking at the old dresses from the attic, Nancy hears a clink and realizes that something is sewn into the hem of the peasant dress, and they rip into it and they find a miniature portrait of a boy about 4 or 5 years old who has a strong resemblance to modern day Pierre. So they go downstairs and they compare this little portrait to Yvette Duval's portrait, and they think they have similar eyes. So Pierre may be distantly related to the Duvals, and in turn, the Thorpes. Ew. So Lisa is obviously dismayed about this because she loves Pierre, but Nancy reassures her and she says, "Don't worry, he wouldn't be a close enough relative to prevent your marriage. After all, your ancestors have been living across the ocean for 2 centuries. Well, whatever Nancy Drew says goes, I guess. But Linda's dad, Norton, is upset, and he doesn't want to believe that Pierre could have had a connection to his wife's side of the family. Like, he's just not willing to accept that. And Nancy just asks point blank what he has against Pierre, and he says a man named Henry Grisson came by and said Pierre couldn't be trusted. So Nancy then explains to him, like, the only con man is Henry himself, not Pierre. And we don't even know if Henry is his real name. So Mr. Thorpe concedes that that might change things. So next, Nancy phones Pierre and has him come to the Thorpe's house, and he announces that he's made a deal with a company on his computer model, and then Mr. Thorpe is all about him now that he's going to be rich. Do you see what I mean? Norton Thorpe, villain. So Nancy says she has a hunch about something else, but she needs Pierre to go to Peachtown with her to check in on something, and he agrees. So they go to Peachtown, but their car overheats on the way and they have to get it fixed. But eventually they're on their way again. And Nancy and Pierre go to the old mill that was Professor Crawford's, and they find a file in his desk. And Nancy reveals that she's pretty sure that Pierre is the present-day Comte de Auvergne. So Pierre may not just be computer technology rich, he may be old aristocratic money rich, which will probably just thrill Lisa's dad to pieces. So at that announcement, Mr. Varney, Pierre's financial backer, and a quote ape-like man, according to the book, named Louis Boucher, come out of the shadows. This was kind of a twist. I was not expecting this, but they say when Nancy's car was in the repair shop the first time, they put a tracker on it, so that's how they were able to follow them and find them. And they say that now they're going to gas them, lock them in Nancy's car, and make sure they die from exhaust fumes. Great! And Mr. Varney is actually French, and Nancy accuses him of being Monsieur Vernet, who, looking at the file a few seconds ago, Nancy had seen Yvette Duval's first married name was Vernet, and Varney must be a relative who could become the Comte in Pierre's absence. So that's why he wants to make sure that it stays that way, that Pierre just stays away from France. Now next, a fight ensues, and Andre Freneau, the swarthy guy who's been following Nancy this entire time, appears out of nowhere and fights alongside Nancy and Pierre. And he says Nancy is right about everything, and the man's name is Etienne Vernet. And Andre is apparently a private French detective, so the two men get taken to jail, and Nancy, Andre, and Pierre go back to the Thorpes. So Nancy continues to explain that Yvette left France out of fear during the Revolution because a lot of aristocrats were being killed. You know, it wasn't real popular to be rich during that time. You know, Marie Antoinette, a lot of other people suffered the guillotine. And her treasure was her son, who's pictured in the portrait that was hidden in her dress. So Nancy and Andre then explain everything else. Yvette left her son in the care of the Michauds, which is how Pierre came to one day be born hundreds of years later in France, bearing that last name. So Mr. Varney and Louis Boucher were trying to sabotage and keep him from the Count title. Now there's also 2 or 3 other questions that we kind of have to get answers to and clear up for this mystery. So first off is the red car that followed Nancy and originally followed Louise Duval. That was driven by Louis Boucher, and the reason why it looked like there was no driver was because he pulled a black hood down over his face. So that solves that mystery. Now, as far as Chief McGinnis and the River Heights Police Department dusting for fingerprints on that suit of armor, they never came back with that. Like, I think at one point Nancy talked to him about giving him the license plate to that green car that was the private detective's, it ended up being in the end. But Chief McGinnis never got back with her, so I'm assuming they just couldn't pull enough fingerprints off to make an identification. Now, the third and final thing that we need to clear up, it was Louis Boucher and Mr. Varney, aka Mr. Vernet. They were the ones trying to break into the museum to steal the picture of the Count, that portrait, because because they didn't want anyone else to question his legal right to be the count, so that solves that mystery as well. So the book ends with Pierre proposing to Lisa, and her dad is a jerk and only approving now that Pierre is a count and heir to a tech fortune. The end. So now let's go on to a segment that I like to call What's Cooking. So there was a lot of food mentioned in this book. There was ice cream sundaes, tea and coffee, chocolate milkshakes, chicken and avocado salad, sausage and pancakes, lamb chops and minted peas. I'm still not done. I'm halfway done. Blueberry pie, orange juice, strawberries on cereal, eggs Benedict, deep breath, apple pie, French pastry, coffee cake, some kind of seafood quiche, and salad, hamburgers, and French fries. That's a lot. Now, as for the things that Nancy could add to her resume, I said that after this mystery, Nancy could consider herself a French historian as well as an ancestral tree expert because she figured out so much about the Duval family and the Michauds and how Pierre fell off the tree and ended up somewhere else, so that was pretty cool. Now let's talk about some things I liked and didn't like about the clue in the ancient disguise. So the things I liked solving an old and new mystery at the same time. I always think that that's really interesting. But as far as the things I didn't like, Nancy visited so many people. Like, I can't fault her for that. She's a great detective. Like, that's what makes a detective, right? But it just was a lot of phone calls, a lot of dead ends. And Norton Thorpe. He was the worst. He literally hated Pierre for the entirety of the book until he figured out that he was going to make lots of money from his computer invention, and bonus, he was a count from France. So yeah, not a fan of Norton Thorpe. So when it comes to giving this book a book rating, I would probably give it a 3.5 magnifying glass. There were some parts that I liked, but then there were some parts that kind of dragged for me. So for next week's episode, we're going to be talking about The Broken Anchor. That's the next book in the Nancy Drew series, and I was just going to give you all a heads up. I'm actually going to be doing a giveaway for that book. So if you guys want to check out my Instagram, I will probably be posting about that over the next few days, and who knows, maybe you'll win a free copy of the book. And this is actually the book that Ransom of the Seven Ships, the game, was loosely based on. They're nothing alike, really. I mean, there's some similarities, but you'll just have to see if I like the book better than the game next week. Until next time, thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.